That weekend, I stood on a rocky shoulder of land in Musandam, the northern tip of Oman, where the desert mountains drop straight into the sea and the water pinches into the most watched corridor on the planet. Out in the dark, a row of tankers sat at anchor, their lights blinking patiently, going nowhere. Steel giants loaded with the lifeblood of the world economy, waiting for permission to move. And on a cracked phone screen propped against a coil of rope, a handful of dock workers leaned in to watch a football match beamed in from half a world away, the green of a distant stadium glowing against their faces. Behind them, the throat of Hormuz lay clenched in the night. In front of them, the planet's largest celebration of human togetherness flickered on 6 inches of glass. It was, I thought, the whole century compressed into a single frame. Because that was the contradiction that opened the summer of 2026. The entire species had been invited to the biggest party it had ever thrown, and the host holding the invitations was, that very weekend, the same power deciding which ships could pass and which supporters could come in. The world was welcome to celebrate its unity by the hand that bolted the gate. And the question that hung in the salt air over those idle tankers was as simple as it was uncomfortable. What did it mean to invite the whole world in and in the same breath decide who actually got through the door? Let me take you back a few days to the moment the ball started to roll. On the 11th of June, at the oldest and most sacred stadium in the Americas, in Mexico City, the host trio opened the tournament and the sky filled with papel picado, that lacework of cut tissue paper the Mexicans turn into pure joy. There were not one but 3 opening ceremonies, spread across 3 countries in 2 days, 48 teams, 104 matches, 5 billion pairs of eyes, the largest spectacle our species has ever assembled, a Super Bowl every single night for 5 weeks. By the 3rd day, Brazilian supporters had taken over the streets of New York. A global superstar had arrived to a stadium roar, and the broadcast machine of the host nation was preparing to air more than a third of all the matches in prime time. The host wanted to show the world the very best of what it was. Now, here is where the postcards started to crack, because the same nation throwing the planet's party had decided to fold that party into a celebration of itself. The tournament happened to land in the same summer the host marked 250 years of its own founding, and special ceremonies were stitched into the calendar to honor that anniversary. The leader of the host even let it be known that the long-awaited understanding with a certain adversary in the Gulf was to be signed conveniently on his own birthday. The world's festival, it turned out, was being quietly repurposed into a mirror, and the face it was asked to reflect was the host's own. And yet the party belonged to others too, in ways the host could never script. By the 3rd day, the streets of New York had turned yellow and green as Brazilian supporters arrived in their thousands, chasing a 6th crown a quarter of a century after their last. A record holder of the trophy carried the hopes of a footballing nation that treats the game as a second faith. African and Latin American sides walked out with the swagger of contenders, not guests. The host had built the stage and sold the tickets, but the soul of the thing, the noise, the color, the belief, was being supplied overwhelmingly by the very global South it was so carefully screening at the border. And that is where the gate appeared. Months earlier, a set of travel restrictions had quietly come down, and inside it were the supporters of nations that were playing in the very tournament, from Iran, from Haiti, from Senegal, from the Ivory Coast. They would not be able to enter to cheer their own teams. The host had made it plain that only the right people would cross its borders. It was a peculiar kind of welcome. Come, celebrate the family of nations, but check your passport at the threshold, and some of you must wait outside. The case of Iran was the most cinematic of all. The official ticketing for Iranian supporters was cancelled at the last minute, leaving hundreds who had already paid for flights and hotels simply stranded. The team itself, the one they called Team Meli, would be lodged across the border in Mexico, crossing only to play its 3 matches, 2 in Los Angeles, 1 in Seattle, and then slipping straight back. The host had even mused aloud that it would prefer Iran left out entirely, with the empty slot handed to Italy, a footballing giant that had failed to qualify. In the end, the governing body confirmed it. Iran would play all three of its matches on the host's own soil, exactly as planned. So, a team without its own traveling supporters would walk onto a Los Angeles pitch, a stadium renamed for the month, in front of the largest Iranian community living outside Iran, a substitute crowd, because the real home supporters had been left at the gate. And the city opening its arms to the planet carried a contradiction of its own. Only a year earlier, that same metropolis had seen federal forces in its streets over a wave of deportations. As the tournament neared, the workers who would pour the drinks and clean the stands, many of them immigrants themselves, voted overwhelmingly to authorize a walkout, marching with signs that demanded the immigration agents be kept away from the games, rolling footballs down the steps of the governing body's offices. Officials promised that enforcement would not happen at the matches and then added the three small words that quietly undid the promise, subject to change. A parallel People's World Cup of film screenings and street art sprang up in answer. The Festival of Unity had arrived in a host that was still holding its breath. Now we arrive at the most surprising part of this story, because none of it was new. Empires have always understood that a stadium is a kind of throne. Think back to a certain summer in Berlin, almost a century ago, when a regime turned an Olympic stadium into the most elaborate showcase of its own power that the world had ever seen. Torches, anthems, architecture, all engineered to tell a story about who was strong and who was destined to lead. The games were never only games, they were a message dressed up as a celebration. The crowd's roar was a referendum without a ballot, and the power that could fill an arena could fill a narrative. Whoever owned the narrative owned far more than a Saturday afternoon. The 20th century kept proving it. When one superpower hosted the games in 1980, much of the other bloc refused to come. 4 years later, when the rival hosted, the favor was returned and half the world stayed home. The stadium had become a proxy arena, a place where nations declared their alignments by who showed up and who did not. And yet sport could open doors as easily as it closed them. A single, almost absurd exchange of table tennis players in the early 1970s thawed a freeze between two giants that diplomats had not managed to crack in decades. A ball, it turned out, could move the board when ambassadors could not. The lesson echoed down to that June. The games were never a sideshow to power. They were one of its oldest instruments. There was an older voice behind all of it. 25 centuries ago, a Greek historian recorded a cold little exchange in which the powerful told the weak, in effect, that the strong did what they had the power to do, and the weak endured what they must. It was the bleakest sentence in the whole study of power, and every empire since has either lived by it or pretended not to. What made that June different was that the weak this time had options: other markets, other currencies, other roads, other patrons. The old sentence still echoed across the water, but for the first time in a long while, the ones it was spoken to could choose to rise and walk away from the table. But the deeper history that weekend was not written on a pitch. It was written on the water. Long before anyone spoke of choke points, the great powers knew that whoever held the throat of the sea held the leash of trade. Byzantium grew fabulously wealthy, guarding a narrow strait, taxing every hull that wished to pass between two worlds. The Ottomans, centuries later, held the same narrows and understood that control of a few miles of water was worth more than a province. The truth was ancient and brutal in its simplicity. Empires rose and fell on the gateways, the straits, the narrows where the whole flow of commerce could be pinched between two fingers. And in June of 2026, one of those throats was pinched tighter than it had been in a generation. And here the ball and the throat finally met, because the same Iran whose young men jogged onto a Los Angeles pitch was the Iran whose coastline guarded the Strait of Hormuz, the narrowest, most consequential energy gateway on the face of the earth, the modern heir to every strait that ever made or broke an empire. Since late February, That gateway had been effectively shut. Insurance had become unaffordable, crews unwilling, traffic a sliver of what it had been. In the spring, the host layered on a cordon of Iranian ports. By June, the most important oil corridor on the planet was running at a fraction of its capacity. And yet, here was the riddle that obsessed every trading desk on Earth. The price of oil refused to behave as the models had promised. It hovered near $105, not the apocalyptic numbers everyone had feared. The answer, whispered the veterans of the oil markets, was that the strait was leaking. Millions of barrels a day were slipping through in the shadows, clandestine tankers, transponders switched off, a ghost fleet threading the cordon in the dark. The market wore a mask of calm over a deep fracture. The big banks warned that if the cordon held just 3 more weeks, the calm could snap and prices could climb toward 120, even 150. Inventories in the wealthy world had fallen to their lowest in more than 2 decades. There was an Asian piece to the puzzle, too. With the southern corridor strangled, the largest buyer of the region's oil quietly told its refiners to keep fuel at home, and global demand itself shrank because a world paying these prices simply consumed less. Part of the market's eerie calm came not from plenty, but from a planet that could no longer afford to move. And then, in the very days the ceremonies blazed, the signals shifted. This is the part that was unfolding in real time as the dock workers in Musandam stared at their phone. Quietly mediated by a third party from South Asia, an understanding was said to be within reach. The host's leader announced that it would be signed within hours, and that the moment it was, the strait would be thrown open to all. A pathway emerged that spoke of phased relief from sanctions and the release of frozen reserves. But the other capital was conspicuously cool. Tehran's spokesman downplayed the timeline, warned against predicting a date, and pointed to what they called the hesitancy of the other side. There were 2 stubborn knots no announcement could untie. Iran wanted the right to keep charging passing ships a toll, a fee for services rendered, which others insisted broke international rules, and Iran insisted that any settlement also calm the flare-ups in southern Lebanon. Aircraft without crews were intercepted over the water one night. The jewels of diplomacy were polished the next morning. 2 faces of the very same ball. The real turning point began right here. Because the host had become a master of holding 2 instruments at once, the velvet glove and the firm hand in the same month with the same hand, while the stadiums sang, the hemisphere was being redrawn. Earlier in the year, the leader of Venezuela had been removed from the scene in a swift operation, and the host announced it would steer the country until a transition was possible, with its great oil companies preparing to move in and repair the fields. Observers reached back 2 centuries for the right comparison, to a doctrine first declared in 1823. The old claim that the Americas were one power's private courtyard, now reborn for the 21st century. Warnings flew toward Colombia, toward Cuba, even toward Greenland, to the astonishment of Europe. The 3 hosts smiled for the cameras of a tournament, while one of them, in a low voice, reasserted dominion over the other's neighborhood. Mexico, the co-host, lit its opening ceremony with cut paper and presidential pride, closed its schools so the capital could breathe on match day, and balanced, with remarkable poise, national dignity against the gravity of the giant next door, between tariffs and turnstiles, between the festival and the fences. Few countries on earth danced on a wire so thin with such grace. For Iran, the grass in Los Angeles was something stranger than sport. It was a stage in the very heart of the adversary, played out while the home coastline sat under cordon and the home supporters were barred. The leadership in Tehran itself had been reshaped since late winter. A new figure, the son of the long-serving one who had left the scene in the opening days of the crisis, now stood at the summit of Iranian power, and on a Californian pitch, the diaspora, the doctors, the shopkeepers, the grandchildren of a city that emptied in another era, became the 12th player, the substitute roar, an entire community lending its voice to a team most of them could no longer visit. To simply be there, to walk onto the grass uninvited yet undeniably present, was a quiet message all its own. Think about what that actually meant. A stadium in Los Angeles would hold, for 90 minutes, a roar in a language the cordon half a world away was trying to mute. The grandparents had left their city in another age, in another world. The grandchildren now painted their faces in the colors of a team they could barely visit. The supporter inside the country was shut out. The supporter outside the country became the only home that remained, and so a team with no traveling crowd of its own won on a stretch of Californian pavement the most emotional gallery of the entire tournament. Sport had stopped being sport, and almost no one in those stands needed it explained. But the most interesting shift of all was not on the famous teams, it was in who now owned the stage at all. And the detail almost nobody put on the highlight reel was this. 4 years earlier, the Games had been hosted by Qatar, a small Gulf monarchy that had turned hydrocarbons into prestige, stadiums into soft power, and a single month of football into a permanent seat at the global table. The Gulf had learned the alchemy, convert the wealth of energy into the currency of attention and influence. In this tournament, the Gulf and the wider Islamic world fielded one team after another. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Morocco, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, Senegal, Uzbekistan. A roll call that would have been unthinkable as a center of gravity only a few decades before. 4 years before that, a Moroccan side had marched all the way to the Final Four and made a continent and a faith dance in the streets, the first African and Arab team ever to climb so high. The pitch had become a preview of the geopolitical map. The so-called periphery was no longer content to be the scenery. Because off the pitch, the same rebalancing was rewriting money itself. To understand it, you have to remember how the old order was built. After the last great global upheaval, a conference at a quiet mountain resort crowned a single currency as the anchor of the world's finance. A generation later, an arrangement tied the world's oil trade to that same currency, and the petro order was born. For half a century, to buy energy was, in effect, to use one nation's money. And that, more than anything, was the quiet engine of its dominance. Now that engine was being challenged in plain sight. The bloc that called itself BRICS, stretched now across Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a widening circle of partners, had moved from talk to plumbing. India had taken the chair, and analysts spoke of a de-dollarization 2.0, payment rails stitched together across national systems, a settlement unit tinged with gold, central bank digital currencies learning to speak to one another. India was settling tens of millions of barrels of oil a month in yuan and in dirhams. The dominant currency's share of the world's reserves had slipped from its old commanding heights. And in the throat of Hormuz itself, the symbolism turned almost literary. The very toll Iran wanted to keep charging was to be collected at the margins in a rival coin. The petro order that had crowned one currency for 50 years was being quietly asked to share the throne. None of it was an accident. It was a response. A tool used too often as an instrument of pressure will, in time, send everyone shopping for armor. And where, in all of this, was Europe? The continent that once wrote the rules for everyone else. Europe spent that same June trying to author a peace it could not enforce. 3 of its leaders, from London, Paris, and Berlin, stood beside Kiev and proposed freezing the long front line and resuming talks. An intermediary carried an offer of a leaders' meeting to Moscow. Moscow declined the direct sit-down. Analysts murmured that the long contest in the east had reached a turning point, that the larger army's momentum was fading and the defenders had clawed back ground. But the striking thing was the choreography. For the first time, it was European capitals, not the old patron across the ocean, scrambling to hold the pen, a continent narrating a standoff in its own backyard, whose ending it no longer controlled. Even at home, the old center had become a chorus rather than the soloist. China, meanwhile, played its longest game. In the same window, its coast guard and the island it claims traded words over patrols near a lonely atoll at the top of a contested sea, and its leader had received the host's leader in Beijing to talk over the island's future. No drama of stadiums there, only the patient pressure of a power that measures time in dynasties, slicing the map thin enough that no single cut ever looks like the one that started something. A civilization with that long a memory does not need a festival to announce itself. And here is where the whole picture clicked into place. Because the front lines of 2026 were not only where you expected to find them, one ran through a strait where 100 miles of water could move the price of everything. One ran through a message between banks where a currency's monopoly was leaking like the very strait it had so long policed. One ran through a stadium turnstile where a visa decided who belonged to the human family that night, and one ran across the old overland roads where, with the southern sea route choked, cargo was being rerouted by land through a revived middle corridor across the Caspian and the Caucasus, and a country straddling two continents pitched itself once again as the indispensable hinge between East and West. The map of the standoff had become the map of connection seen in negative, for the new roads were no longer a metaphor. With the southern sea lane choked, the overland corridor through Central Asia, the Caspian and the Caucasus surged in relevance almost overnight. Rail lines and ports that had spent years as afterthoughts suddenly drew fresh billions, and a country bridging Europe and Asia presented itself once again as the safe harbor between the two halves of the world. What the caravans of 1,000 years ago understood, the logistics planners of 2026 rediscovered in a hurry. When one throat closes, the old roads remember how to carry the load. Geography, it turned out, kept a longer memory than any single empire's map. There is a reason the powerful have always loved a spectacle. A grand enough show does not merely entertain. It confers legitimacy, it manufactures consent, it lets a crowd feel like a willing part of something it never voted on. To host the world is to be seen for a month as the natural center of it, the gracious convener, the indispensable stage. That was the deeper prize the host was chasing, larger than any single result on the pitch. Not merely to win matches, but to be confirmed in front of 5 billion witnesses as the place where the world still came together. And that was precisely the prize that was slipping quietly from its grasp. Step back far enough and the tournament stopped being a tournament. It became a mirror. The host could still throw the largest party the species had ever seen, 5 billion watching a Super Bowl every night, and could even fold that party into the celebration of its own 250th birthday. What it could no longer do was dictate who came to its own party. It could bolt the gates against supporters, cordon a strait, redraw a hemisphere, and still the ball rolled, the global south filled the brackets, the rival currencies stitched their rails, the overland roads reopened. Unipolarity does not end with a single thunderclap. It ends the way a stadium empties, slowly, section by section, until the host looks up and realizes the crowd has quietly rearranged itself. They say football is the universal language, the one tongue that needs no translation, spoken equally in a favela in Rio, an alley in Lagos, a rooftop in Tehran. Perhaps it is true. But in June of 2026, that universal language was played inside a world that was busy raising walls again, charging tolls again, checking passports at the door of the party. And the contrast was not a footnote. It was the headline itself. The ball said we are all one. The gate answered, but some are more welcome than others. Between those two sentences sat the entire century. That was the quiet revelation of that summer. Geopolitics and geoeconomics had fused, and they had done it in broad daylight on a pitch lit for 5 billion eyes. The same Iran on the grass in Los Angeles was the Iran in the Strait, and the Iran charging a toll in a rival coin. The same host lighting the ceremonies was the host holding the cordon and redrawing the Americas. The same global south dancing in the brackets was the global south laying a parallel financial spine. The festival and the fault lines were never two stories, they were one. So I went back in my mind to that rocky shoulder of land in Musandam, the night the tankers sat idle in the dark and the dock workers leaned into a 6-inch screen. And I thought about how in July someone would lift a trophy under the lights of a stadium near New York and the cameras would remember the goals. But the deeper game, the one that decided the century, was never only about the goals. It was about the gates and the throats and the question of who was still allowed to move. And that is the question that stayed with me, the one I want to leave on the table before the next chapter. In a world where the same hand offers you the ball, bolts the door, and decides which ships may pass, who, in the end, hosts the future? Is it the one who owns the stadium or the one the crowd has quietly decided to become? Hold that question close, because the next time the throat of Hormuz, the brackets of a tournament, and the plumbing of money line up in the very same week, the answer may already be out on the field, and we will read it together. Until next time.